If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
You are listening to Mindshock. This is the Hollow Earth series, part 3, Agartha and Shambhala. In the previous episodes, I had gone over Hollow Earth in ancient civilization, belief systems, spirituality, and historical context. And in episode 2 was the Celtic focus, which is often overlooked in the great myths, and particularly in Hollow Earth, where there's a lot of material to delve into there. So if you haven't checked those out, check those out. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. If you like this video, feel free to share it across social media platforms like our Facebook page, and you could also check us out on Twitter, Reddit, Patreon. Okay, in this episode, I would like to specifically focus on Agartha, also known as Shambhala, and sometimes this is also used in conjunction with Shangri-La. A lot of different pronunciations and etymologies. But Shangri-La, Shambhala, Agartha, these are all kind of Buddhist in origin, or Tibetan, or other ancient civilizations of that area referred to this land, and there is quite a bit to cover on Agartha. I touched upon it briefly in the previous episodes, but it definitely needs its own dedication. So we will be going deep into anything and everything that is Agartha. So Professor Henrique J. de Souza, president of the Brazilian Theosophical Society and a leading authority on the subterranean world, wrote this article, "Does Shangri-La Exist?" And this was actually published in his own magazine. And so this is from this article, which is a very, very interesting and a good introduction to this idea of a sacred city in Hollow Earth, or possibly just another name for a Hollow Earth realm, if it's not exactly physical. A lot of theories to discuss, but this is Mindshock, and the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. So, de Souza writes, among all races of mankind back to the dawn of time, there existed a tradition concerning the existence of a sacred land, or terrestrial paradise, where the highest ideals of humanity were living realities. This concept is found in the most ancient writings and traditions of the peoples of Europe, Asia Minor, China, India, Egypt, and the Americas. This sacred land, it is said, can be known only to persons who are worthy, pure, and innocent, for which reason it constitutes the central theme of the dreams of childhood. The road that leads to this blessed land, this invisible world, this esoteric and occult domain, constitutes the central quest and master key of all mystery teachings and systems of initiation in the past, present, and future. The road that leads to this blessed land, this invisible world, this esoteric and occult domain, constitutes the central quest and master key of all mystery teachings and systems of initiation in the past, present, and future. This magic key is the open sesame that unlocks the door to a new and marvelous world. The old Rosicrucians designated it by the French word vitriol, which is a combination of the first letters of the sentence Vista interiora terrae rectificando inienes omnia lapidem, to indicate that in the interior of the earth is hidden the true mystery. The path that leads to this hidden world is the way of initiation. In ancient Greece, the mysteries of Delphos and Eleusis, this heavenly land was referred to as Mount Olympus and the Elysian Fields. Also, in the earliest Vedic times, it was called by various names, such as Ratnasanu, the peak of the precious stone, Hermadri, the mountain of gold, and Mount Meru, home of the gods and Olympus of the Hindus. Symbolically, the peak of the sacred mountain is in the sky, its middle portion on the earth, and its base in the subterranean world. The Scandinavian Eddas also mention the celestial city, which was in the subterranean land of Asar, of the peoples of Mesopotamia. It was the land of Amenti, of the sacred book of the dead of the ancient Egyptians. It was the city of the 7 petals of Vishnu, and the city of the 7 kings of Edom or Eden of Judaic tradition. In other words, it was the terrestrial paradise. In all Asia Minor, not only in the past but also today, there exists a belief in the existence of a city of mystery full of marvels, which is also known as Shambhala or Shambhala, where is the temple of the gods. It is also the Urdamph of the Tibetans and Mongols. The Persians call it Alberdi or Aryana, land of their ancestors. The Hebrews called it Canaan, and the Mexicans Tula or Tolan, while the Aztecs called it Mayapan. The Spanish conquerors who came to America believed in the existence of such a city and organized many expeditions to find it, calling it El Dorado, or City of Gold. They probably learned about it from the Aborigines, who called it by the name of Manoa, or City whose king wears clothing of gold. By the Celts, this holy land was known as Land of the Mysteries, Duat or Dadanda. A Chinese tradition speaks of Land of Chivin, or the city of a dozen serpents. It is the subterranean world which lies at the roots of heaven. It is the land of Calchas, Chalcis, or Kalki, the famous Colchida for which the Argonauts sought when they set out in search of the Golden Fleece. In the Middle Ages, it was referred to as the Isle of Avalon, where the Knights of the Round Table, under the leadership of King Arthur and under the guidance of the magician Merlin, went in search of the Holy Grail, symbol of obedience, justice, and immortality. When King Arthur was seriously wounded in battle, he requested his companion Belvedere to depart on a boat to the confines of the earth with the following words: "Farewell, my friend and companion Belvedere, and to the land where it never rains, where there is no sickness, and where nobody dies." This is the land of immortality, or Agartha, the subterranean world. This land is the Walhalla of the Germans, the Monte Salvet of the Knights of the Holy Grail, the Utopia of Thomas More, the City of the Sun of Campanella, the Shangri-La of Tibet, and the Agartha of the Buddhist world. So in that brief intro, Henrique J. de Souza basically, some people would call it conflating, or kind of mixing and matching myths and legends to kind of all fit Hollow Earth. But here's the thing. They might, since we don't know for sure. I have not been on any expeditions to the interior of the Earth or Hollow Earth, so I don't know. But it does seem interesting how all of the ancients were very interested in the workings of the inner earth, and as I've speculated in the previous podcasts, we might not be talking a physical realm, or as our human brains currently understand with current physics of what physical means. If this is some kind of spiritual realm or another dimension, that opens the door to quite a few theories and possibilities, and we don't know which context a lot of these ancient texts translated and mistranslated, and the broken telephone effect, what we are left with, how much of it is true, how much of it is accurate, we don't know, so all we can do is theorize and speculate. The next excerpt I'm going to read is from the book The Hollow Earth. This is by Dr. R.W. Bernard, and he's a PhD for people who believe that matters in some way. But this isn't some kook druggy slob sitting in his mom's basement on a GeoCities blog. These are educated researchers, historians, and just very dedicated professional individuals. So this is Agartha, the Subterranean World, from the book The Hollow Earth, Chapter 7. The word Agartha is of Buddhist origin. It refers to the subterranean world or empire, in whose existence all true Buddhists fervently believe. They also believe that this subterranean world has millions of inhabitants and many cities, all under the supreme domination of the subterranean world capital, Shambhala, where dwells the supreme ruler of this empire, known in the Orient as the King of the World. It is believed that he gave his orders to the Dalai Lama of Tibet, who was his terrestrial representative, his messages being transmitted through certain secret tunnels connecting the subterranean world with Tibet. So in this description, basically Agartha is this subterranean world. Shambhala is the capital city. Obviously, this differs in different theories. Similar mysterious tunnels honeycomb Brazil. Brazil in the west and Tibet in the east seem to be the two parts of the earth where contact between the subterranean world and the surface world may be most easily achieved due to the existence of these tunnels. Obviously, this also depends on which model of the earth you're running with. Some people, the flat earthers would claim that the earth is a flat plane. If that is true, then all of the tunnels underneath all of the areas of the world would be able to connect either way. Or if it's a globe or spherical, the tunnels would just have to be that much longer. The famous Russian artist, philosopher, and explorer Nicholas Roerich, who traveled extensively in the Far East, claimed that Lhasa, capital of Tibet, was connected by a tunnel with Shambhala, capital of the subterranean empire of Agartha. The entrance of this tunnel was guarded by lamas who were sworn to keep its actual whereabouts a secret from outsiders by order of the Dalai Lama. A similar tunnel was believed to connect the secret chambers at the base of the Pyramid of Giza with the subterranean world, by which the pharaohs established contact with the gods or supermen of the underworld. So you know what else is an interesting theory? Some people believe that in the ancient alien theory, they believe that these gods or whatnot, ancient civilizations called these alien entities or extraterrestrials gods, and these were the same extraterrestrials that kind of traveled around and helped the lowly, uneducated humans of the world and gave them vast technology and knowledge. But what's interesting is here we are presented with a theory that the realm of Agartha, with these non-human entities, or gods, if you will, made contact with ancient civilizations through these tunnels. So that would point there to be no extraterrestrials, but mostly intraterrestrials. So these hollow earth gods could have possibly accounted for some of this knowledge or technology if this ancient theory is true. Which, very, very interesting. And then, of course, some people believe that UFOs come from hollow Earth and not from space or other planets. So, a lot of different theories on the table here. The various gigantic statues of early Egyptian gods and kings, as those of Buddha, found throughout the Orient, represent subterranean supermen who came to the surface to help the human race. They are generally represented as sexless. They were emissaries of Agartha, the subterranean paradise which it is the goal of all true Buddhists to reach. The Buddhist traditions state that Agartha was first colonized many thousands of years ago when a holy man led a tribe which disappeared underground. The gypsies are supposed to come from Agartha, which explains their restlessness on the Earth's surface and their continual travels to regain their lost home. That's pretty interesting. This reminds one of Noah, who was really an Atlantean. I don't know where this guy's getting his info from, but that's pretty interesting. Who saved a worthy group prior to the coming of the flood that submerged Atlantis. It is believed that he brought his group to the high plateau of Brazil, where they settled in subterranean cities connected with the surface by tunnels in order to escape from poisoning by the radioactive fallout produced by the nuclear war the Atlanteans fought, which brought on the flood that submerged their continent. The subterranean civilization of Agartha is believed to represent a continuation of Atlantean civilization, which, having learned the lesson of the futility of war, remained in a state of peace ever since, making stupendous scientific progress uninterrupted by the setbacks of recurrent wars, as our surface civilization has been. Their civilization is many thousands of years old. Atlantis sank about 11,500 years ago, while ours is very young, only a few centuries old. Some people dispute this as well, and if you haven't checked out the Mindshock Alternate History podcast series, you could check that out. We go over mud flood and some of the problems with the currently accepted timeline of history and certain anomalies that might account for a completely different representation of the history of Earth. But continuing on here, subterranean scientists are able to wield forces of nature we know nothing about, as demonstrated by their flying saucers, which are operated by a new, unknown source of energy more subtle than atomic energy. Ossendowski claims that the Empire of Agartha consists of a network of subterranean cities connected with each other by tunnels, through which vehicles pass at tremendous speed both under land and under the ocean. These people live under the benign reign of a government headed by the King of the World. They represent descendants of the lost continents of Lemuria and Atlantis, as well as the original perfect race of Hyperboreans, the race of gods. During various epochs in history, the Agarthan supermen, or gods, came to the surface to teach the human race and save it from wars, catastrophes, and destruction. The coming of the flying saucers soon after the first atomic explosion in Hiroshima represents another such visitation. But the time the gods themselves did not appear among men, but they sent their emissaries. The Indian epic Ramayana describes Rama as such an emissary from Agartha coming on an aerial vehicle, which was probably a flying saucer. A Chinese tradition speaks of divine teachers coming on aerial vehicles. Similarly, the founder of the Inca dynasty, Manca Capac, came the same way. One of the greatest of Agarthan teachers in America was Quetzalcoatl, the great prophet of the Mayas and Aztecs and of the Indians of the Americas in general, both in South and North America. That he was a stranger among them coming from a different race, Atlantean, is indicated by his being fair while they were dark, his being tall while they were short, his being bearded while they were beardless. He was reverenced as a savior by the Indians of Mexico, Yucatan, and Guatemala long before the coming of the white man. The Aztecs called him God of Abundance and the Morning Star. His name, Quetzalcoatl, means feathered serpent, meaning a teacher of wisdom, symbolized by the serpent, who flies. He was given this name because he came on an aerial vehicle, which appears to have been a flying saucer. He probably came from the subterranean world because after he remained some time with the Indians, he vanished. He mysteriously vanished the same way he came, and was believed to have returned to the subterranean world from which he came. Quetzalcoatl is described as having been a man of good appearance and grave countenance, with white skin and a beard, and dressed in a long, flowing white garment. He was also called Humak because of his great goodness and continence. He taught the Indians the way of virtue and tried to save them from vice by giving them laws and counsel to restrain them from lust and to practice chastity. He taught pacifism and condemned violence in all forms. He instituted a vegetarian diet with corn as a principal food and taught fasting and body hygiene. According to the South American archaeologist Harold Wilkins, Quetzalcoatl was also the spiritual teacher of the ancient inhabitants of Brazil. Brazil keeps coming up a lot here, which is kind of interesting because it's usually not as talked about as much as the Egyptians, the Greeks, the ancient Hindus, Chinese, and natives of North America and Central America. After remaining some time with the Indians and seeing how little they cared to follow his teachings, accept his recommendation to plant and eat corn as a basic food in place of meat, Quetzalcoatl departed, telling them that someday he would return. That this visitor from heaven left the same way in which he came, on a flying saucer, is indicated by the following facts. When Cortez invaded Mexico, the Emperor Montezuma believed that the predicted return of Quetzalcoatl had occurred because a fireball then gyrated over Mexico City, making the people wail and scream, setting the temple of the war god on fire. The fireball was believed to have been the flying saucer on which Quetzalcoatl traveled. Osiris was another such subterranean god. According to Donnelly in his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, the gods of the ancients were the rulers of Atlantis and members of a superhuman race which governed the human race. Before the destruction of their continent, which they foresaw, they traveled by flying saucer through the polar opening to the subterranean world in the hollow interior of the earth, where they continued to live ever since. So that's pretty interesting. The rulers foresaw the destruction, and they escaped. Is that another typical Great Flood story? That would be interesting if Noah really was an Atlantean and this other race, and whether it was God or whatnot in the broken telephone translations we have, if there was some kind of cataclysm coming and there was some source that informed them of it. Was travel to Hollow Earth, is that the description of the Ark? And Noah and the Great Flood. Some people think the Ark was a DNA databank, and he didn't physically take all of the animals and all of the life on a boat. So once again, depending on who wrote the book, from which ancient text translated how many times, how could they describe, a DNA databank in certain words? They used it, a boat, an ark. Yeah, that's a topic for something else, but that's an interesting theory. The Empire of Agartha, wrote Ossendowski in his book Beasts, Men, and Gods, extends through subterranean tunnels to all parts of the world. In this book, he speaks of a vast network of tunnels constructed by a prehistoric race of remotest antiquity, which passed under both oceans and continents, through which swift-moving vehicles traveled. The Empire, of which Ossendowski speaks and concerning which he learned about from lamas in the Far East during his travels in Mongolia, obviously consists of a subterranean cities inside the Earth's crust, which should be differentiated from those existing in its hollow center. Thus, there are two subterranean worlds, one more superficial and one in the center of the Earth. So that's also pretty interesting. And the other thing that jumps out at me here is the network of tunnels also under the oceans. Or what about the ocean floor? So some of these satellite images or high altitude plane images that Google Earth consists of are very interesting. You see a lot of anomalies. It looks like there were gigantic machines or objects dragged across the ocean floor in various patterns, not quite natural looking. You have the possible remnants of cities, you have Bimini Wall, things like that, but also just looking across the vast expanses of oceans all over the world, far from continents or land. There's some weird stuff on the ocean floors, and that's what can be seen with these images. Obviously, a survey study of the ocean floor, a complete survey study of the ocean floor all over the world, throughout the entire Earth, that would be one interesting study. Because, 70% of the oceans are unexplored? I forget what number is kind of thrown around by scientists, which is kind of interesting, too, because unless you believe in the ancient astronaut theory, it seems like there's all this time and energy being devoted to space exploration and other planets, It's kind of weird because our own history, or at least closer to our history, is right here on Earth, and there's so much that's unexplored here that's very expensive to do. I mean, how expensive would it be to map the entire ocean floor, to explore every inch of the ocean floor all over the world? I mean, that's a mind-boggling or mind-shocking proposition. It would require a ton of money. You'd have to put up basically all of NASA's budget into mapping the ocean floor, which I think would be just very, very interesting. Just incredibly interesting, which would unlock a lot of secrets of our past. Huguenin, whose books on flying saucers and the subterranean world we previously mentioned, believes that there exists many subterranean cities at various depths between the Earth's crust and its hollow interior. Concerning the inhabitants of these subterranean cities, he writes, "This other humanity has reached an elevated grade of civilization, economic and social organization, and cultural and scientific progress in comparison with which the humanity which lives on the Earth's surface are a race of barbarians." In his book, Huguenin shows a diagram of the Earth's interior showing various subterranean cities at various depths connected with each other by tunnels. He describes these cities as existing in immense cavities in the Earth. The city of Shambhala, the capital of the subterranean empire, he portrays as existing at the center of the Earth in its hollow interior rather than inside its solid crust. Ossendowski writes, "All the subterranean caverns of America are inhabited by an ancient people who disappeared from the world. These people and the subterranean regions where they dwell are under the supreme authority of the King of the world. Both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were once the home of vast continents which later became submerged, and their inhabitants found a refuge in the subterranean world. The profounder caverns are illuminated by a resplendent light which permits the growing of cereals and other vegetables and gives the inhabitants a long lifespan free from disease. In this world exists a large population and many tribes." Okay, so here's something that needs to be addressed, obviously. Any logical exploration of this Hollow Earth theory, we'll get into the scientific models of Hollow Earth theory in the next few episodes and how the scientific models evolved in their history. There are some that actually have an interior sun and moon. But let's put that aside for a second. So in this guy's theory, if there is different layers of Hollow Earth with different cities and different layers, and as you descend to the dead center, you get more and more advanced and spiritually enlightened. I'm guessing from his model here, as Shambhala would be the capital city, with the most enlightened gods or whatnot superior to the others. However, for some of these layers, are these humans? Because if these ancient civilizations or ancient humans fled the surface for whatever reason, either radiation, whatnot, which, by the way, that's an interesting tie-in to Mudflood and some of these other cities where you had disappearing populations and these cities were just empty. Where did all these people go? We explore those topics in our alternate history podcast, but just as a quick aside here, if there were some kind of disasters all throughout history, regardless of which timeline we're using, even as early as 100 or 200 years ago, if some of these evacuations from these cities occurred into Hollow Earth, it's interesting because humans need sunlight to survive or to thrive. There's a lot of vitamins in sunlight. You need sunlight, you need fresh air, fresh water. So, there's plenty of underground lakes. Some of them are gigantic. The one under Russia is just huge, miles and miles. But so maybe they have clean water. Okay, so now what about air? So let's say if it's in caverns and rocks with a lot of minerals, maybe the air is clean, okay. If they're growing plants and whatnot, maybe they're getting oxygen. But what about sunlight? So that kind of jumps out at me as it's difficult to imagine someone surviving and living a healthy life without the nourishing sun. Unless there's something else, if they're that advanced technologically, are they taking vitamin D3 supplements and all these other supplements to not have sunlight? Or, once again, if there is some kind of interior sun, but depending on how the layers of Hollow Earth work, If it's just kind of an interior Earth, the inverse with the sun and the moon, they would still have that. I don't know. Just these are questions that need to be asked because any kind of logical examination of Hollow Earth needs to really go deep enough to address some of these issues. In his book, The Coming Race, Bulwer Lytton describes a subterranean civilization far in advance of our own, which existed in a large cavity in the earth connected with the surface by a tunnel. This immense cavity was illuminated by a strange light which did not require lamps to produce it, but appeared to result from an electrification of the atmosphere. This light supported plant life and enabled the subterranean people to grow their foods. The inhabitants of the utopia described by Lytton were vegetarians. They had certain apparatuses by which, instead of walking, they flew. They were free from disease and had a perfect social organization so that each received what he needed without exploitation of one by another. Okay, that's interesting. So Bulwer Lytton does answer this question of light, which is very, very interesting. An immense cavity which illuminated by a strange light. So strangeness is what we have to explain this. Interesting nonetheless. It is claimed that the Earth's crust is honeycombed by a network of tunnels passing under the ocean from continent to continent and leading to subterranean cities in large cavities in the Earth. These tunnels are especially abundant in South America, especially under Brazil, which was the chief center of Atlantean colonization. Here we go with Brazil again. Very interesting. And we may believe that they were constructed by the Atlanteans. Most famous of these tunnels is the roadway of the Incas, which stretches for several hundred miles south of Lima, Peru, and passes under Cuzco, Tiwanaku, and the Three Peaks proceeding to the Atacambo Desert. Another branch opens in Arica, Chile, visited by Madame Blavatsky of Theosophy. It is claimed that the Incas used these tunnels to escape from the Spanish conquerors and the Inquisition, when entire armies entered them, carrying with them their gold and treasures on the back of the llamas, which they did when the Spanish conquerors first came. Their mysterious disappearance at this time, leaving only the race of Quechua Indians behind, is also explained by their entering these tunnels. It is claimed that when Atahualpa, the last of the Inca kings who was brutally murdered by Pizarro, the gold that was being carried to his ransom on a train of 11,000 pack llamas found refuge in these tunnels. It is claimed that these tunnels had a form of artificial lighting and were built by the race that had constructed Tiwanaku long before the first Inca appeared in Peru. And Tiwanaku is, that's one of the most fascinating ancient sites on Earth because the locals that arrived there, their legend states that, so the locals, we're talking thousands of years ago, they claimed that the ancients, so in their ancient time, their ancients, that was an ancient city. So obviously modern historians and archaeologists, their claims are kind of silly that these farmers and very unadvanced local peoples built Tiwanaku when these same people, they don't take credit for it. They said it was the ancients, their ancients. So who knows? But it's very fascinating, Tiwanaku. And especially the technology with which those stones were cut. We're talking laser precision. Since the Incas who entered these tunnels to escape from the Spaniards were never seen since and disappeared from the Earth's surface, it is probable that they continued to live in an illuminated subterranean cities to which these tunnels led. These mysterious tunnels, an enigma to archaeologists, exist in greatest number under Brazil, where they open on the surface in various places. The most famous is on the Roncador Mountains of northeast Mato Grosso, to where Colonel Fawcett was heading when last seen. It is claimed that the Atlantean city for which he searched was not the ruins of a dead city on the surface, but a subterranean city with still living Atlanteans as its inhabitants, and that he and his son Jack reached this city and are still living therein. This is the belief of Professor de Souza, Commander Strauss, and O.C. Hugenin, whom we have mentioned before. The Roncador tunnel opening is guarded by fierce Cervantes Indians, who kill anyone who dares to enter uninvited and who might molest the subterranean dwellers whom they respect and revere. The Mursego Indians also guard these secret tunnel openings leading to the subterranean cities in the Roncador mountain region of Mato Grosso. We quote a letter to the author from an American named Carl Hooney, who lived many years in Mato Grosso and made a special study of this subject. The entrance to the caverns is guarded by Mursego Indians, who are dark-skinned, undersized race of great physical strength. Their sense of smell is more developed than that of the best bloodhounds. Even if they approve of you and let you enter the caverns, I am afraid that you will be lost to the present world, because they guard the secret very carefully and may not let those who enter leave. This may have happened to Colonel Fawcett and his son Jack, who are believed to have entered a tunnel leading to a subterranean city in the Roncador Mountains, never to return. The Mursego Indians live in caverns and go out at night into the surrounding jungles, but they have no contact with the subterranean dwellers below, inhabiting a subterranean city in which they form a self-contained community and have a considerable population. It is believed that the subterranean cities they inhabit were first constructed by the Atlanteans. One thing is certain, that no radioactive fallout can reach them. No one knows whether those who live in these ancient Atlantean subterranean cities are Atlanteans themselves or others who settled there after their original builders were gone. Here's another interesting thing. If the Atlanteans and their nuclear or some kind of technologically advanced war resulting in incredible radiation that caused so much death and destruction on the surface, if they're that enlightened or wise, maybe they know that it's kind of the hubris of man that leads to history repeating itself, and that there will always be wars on the surface. So this whole hollow earth legend or ideology that's lived by more advanced civilizations that kind of fled the surface and let the surface dwellers kind of go on their way or go about their own business in a cycle of destruction and never-ending wars and technologies, and the wiping out of civilizations, then starting all over and then developing technology to the point where they can wipe themselves out again. So that's kind of interesting if this kind of the cycle of time just always repeats itself, and Hollow Earth or some of these subterranean cities are kind of like a counter to it, where certain civilizations have found that it'll just keep happening on the surface. So the Hollow Earth is the secret realm where only the enlightened can go, as to not cause corruption within this realm that kind of is unaffected by the so-called barbarians on the surface, regardless of how quickly technology moves and just enables humans to destroy themselves faster on the surface. But this isn't occurring in Hollow Earth. Just a lot of interesting things, a lot of mind-shocking things to ponder about Hollow Earth. The questions never cease. The name of the mountain range where these Atlantean subterranean cities exist in Roncador in northeast Mato Grosso. If you go in quest of these subterranean cities, take your life in your own hands, as you may never be heard of again, like Colonel Fawcett. When I was in Brazil, I heard a lot about the underground caverns and subterranean cities. They are, however, a long way from Cuiabá. They are near the Rio Araguaia, which empties into the Amazon. They are to the northeast of Cuiabá, at the foot of the tremendously long mountain range named Roncador. I desisted to investigate further because I heard that the Mursego Indians jealously guard the entrance to the tunnels from people who are not sufficiently developed, because they do not want trouble. In the first place, they do not want anyone who is still enmeshed in commercialism and who has a desire for money. The other thing that's kind of strange, though, is so these tribes were kind of chosen to guard the entrances, and they're content with that. It's kind of weird. Wouldn't you want to be in Hollow Earth? Wouldn't you want to be enlightened with the Atlanteans? Or were they kind of brainwashed into just thinking it's their duty to guard these tunnels? And then once again, I mean, obviously the governments can just mow over these ancient tribes with their spears. You know, you just show up with a SWAT team or some kind of Marine unit, Special Forces unit, shoot them all, go in. I mean, was that already done? I mean, these are old books here, decades and decades old, close to a century old, some of them. So was this already done? We don't know. Or is there some kind of pact or conspiracy or agreement of some kind where these tribes are not to be harmed and these entrances are not to be divulged, where governments would not do this? Although it seems like governments and secret programs would have already done this, and if these are tunnels all over the world, you don't need to go to that particular entrance in Brazil. It's all very, very strange. There are also caverns in Asia, and Tibetan travelers mention them, but as far as I know, in Brazil are the biggest ones, and they exist at 3 different levels. I am sure I would get permission if I wanted to join them, and they would accept me as one of theirs. I know they use no money at all, and their society is organized on a strictly democratic basis. People do not become aged and live in everlasting harmony. So here's another problem with this Mr. Huney guy. He states, I am sure I would get permission, and if I wanted to join them, and they would accept me as one of their own. So, well, first of all, why does he think that? Is he just anti-commercialism and pure of heart? And if that's true, why hasn't he already done this? He prefers to live in commercialism? I mean, I suppose if he's a family man, he has family members, he doesn't want to leave them, and they don't want to go. I mean, I don't know. There could be a lot of motivations, but automatically, like, I'm always skeptical of the claim, oh, well, I could if I want to, I just don't. I mean, it's one thing if you're kind of like Fawcett, where you make certain claims and say you're looking for this or you're looking for that, and then you disappear and never found again. You know, it's good to make that statement before you go. That way, if you want the rest of the world to know. Like this Mr. Huney guy, he's putting this out. Or maybe not, if he just wrote this private. Actually, if this is a private letter from one person to another, that's kind of different. But now that it's been published in a book, these people, I'm skeptical of these people that kind of make these claims to have the world know. But if the claims were true, you have to ask yourself, if you were in this person's position, what would you do? It's curious. This subterranean utopia mentioned by Mr. Huney, now residing in New York, seems to resemble greatly the one described by Bulwer Lytton in his book The Coming Race. Lytton was a Rosicrucian and probably based his novel on occult information concerning existing subterranean cities. The ruins of a number of Atlantean cities were found in northern Mato Grosso and the Amazon territory, indicating that Atlanteans once colonized this country. Some years ago, an English school teacher, hearing rumors of a lost Atlantean city on a high plateau in this region, went to find it. He did, but the hardships of the journey cost him his life. Before he died, he sent by carrier pigeon a note describing a magnificent city he discovered, whose streets were lined by high gold statues. That's pretty interesting. Tracking that claim down would be very, very interesting. If the Atlanteans once colonized Brazil and constructed cities in Mato Grosso on its surface, why did they build subterranean cities there? It could not have been to escape the deluge that submerged Atlantis and outlying areas, because Mato Grosso is a high plateau where floodwaters could not have reached. That's very interesting. The South American archaeologist Harold Wilkins offers another theory, that the subterranean cities were built to escape the radioactive fallout resulting from a nuclear war the Atlanteans fought. This seems to be a very reasonable explanation, or otherwise here would be no reason to undergo the great labor of excavating the earth and constructing subterranean cities where the Atlanteans already had magnificent cities on the earth's surface. If and when we are endangered by a nuclear war, we too will have to find refuge inside the earth and dwell there in illuminated subterranean cities and produce our food under the light. It would, of course, be much easier to join existing subterranean cities constructed by the Atlanteans thousands of years ago, who vastly surpassed us in engineering skill, than to construct our own. If friendly contact with subterranean dwellers could be established when war came, or even before, when radioactive fallout increases beyond the danger point and menaces our survival, it would be to our advantage to contact these subterranean cities, and if we are admitted, to establish residence in them. Now, it's interesting if this was already done or not by certain governments, as the extraterrestrial conspiracy theory sometimes includes government officials making deals with extraterrestrial entities of various kinds, but those are topics for other podcasts. There is no old age in Agartha, and no death. It is a society in which everyone is young-looking, even if many centuries or even thousands of years of age. This seems incredible to surface dwellers exposed to the harmful effects of solar radiation and the auto-intoxication of food poisoning from a wrong diet. The symptoms of old age are not the natural result of the passage of time nor an assumed aging process, but to adverse biological conditions and habits. Senility is a disease, and since Agarthans are free from disease, they do not grow old. You know what else is interesting in the Bible? You have Noah, Methuselah, some of these old Bible figures that lived to hundreds, if not close to 1,000 years old. That's pretty interesting as well, if they were Atlanteans. A lot of different theories. The superior scientific culture of the subterranean people, of which their flying saucers are an evident example, is the result of superior brain development and more energetic brains. This is due to the fact that their vital energies flow up to their brain rather than being dissipated through the sexual channel as among so-called civilized surface races. In fact, sex indulgence is completely out of their lives. Because of their fruit diet, their endocrines are in a state of perfect balance and harmonious functioning, as in little children, and are not stimulated by abnormal activity by metabolic toxins, as produced by such foods as meat, fowl, fish, and eggs, and by such aphrodisiacs as salt, pepper, coffee, tobacco, and alcohol. That's an interesting comment. By keeping their bloodstream pure and free from toxins, the subterranean people are able to live in complete continence, conserving all vital energies and converting them into superior brain power. Their superior scientific achievements result from the fact that their brains are superior to ours in intellectual development. I mean, that's pretty interesting and hilarious depending on how you look at it. I mean, we might have a bunch of Sheldon Coopers that are not driven by any kind of sexual motivations, leaving their energies to pursue scientific exploits and knowledge to further the advancement of their race. That's very, very interesting. Also, the comment about certain drugs being aphrodisiacs. That's pretty interesting. Salt, pepper. I'm not sure about pepper. Not sure about salt either. But coffee, tobacco, alcohol, those there has been some material written about that, linking that with certain sexual tendencies. So that's all pretty interesting stuff. The next article I'm going to read is Agartha in the Hollow Earth by Dr. Joshua David Stone. You know, there's a lot of doctors, PhDs, professional historians that are researching these topics, so they're often laughed about in the mainstream, ridiculed. And it's pretty funny. I mean, it's kind of like all great truths began as blasphemies. This seems like complete idiocy or mythology, but if it's true, how silly is it to not examine it? True science is, of course, neutral and objective. One of my favorite quotes is, "The mark of an educated mind is to consider an idea, concept, or belief as true without believing in it." I'm not claiming the earth is hollow. I'm just saying a lot of these historical texts are very interesting. A lot of their ancient knowledge is very interesting, and there's a lot to be learned here regardless of what the truth is. Dr. Joshua David Stone writes, "The biggest cover-up of all time is the fact that there is a civilization of people living in the center of Earth whose civilization's name is known as Agartha. This may be hard for some of you to believe. I know it was for me at first. However, I now have an absolute knowingness of the truth of this. To begin with, the Buddhists, in their theology, fervently believe in its existence. They believe it to be a race of supermen and women occasionally come to the surface to oversee the development of the human race. They also believe that the subterranean world has millions of inhabitants and many cities, and their capital is Shambhala. The master of this world was believed to have given orders to the Dalai Lama of Tibet, who was his terrestrial representative. His messages were being transmitted through certain secret tunnels connecting this inner world with Tibet. The famous Russian channel Nicholas Roerich, who is a channel for the ascended master El Morya, claimed that Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, was connected by a tunnel with the inner earth Shambhala. The entrance of this tunnel was guarded by lamas who were sworn to secrecy. A similar tunnel was believed to connect the secret chambers at the base of the Great Pyramid to Giza and Agartha. The Indian epic, the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Gita, are the two most famous texts of India. The Ramayana tells the story of the great avatar, Rama. The Bhagavad Gita tells the story of Krishna. The Ramayana describes Rama as an emissary from Agartha who arrived on an air vehicle. An air vehicle. This is quite extraordinary in that both the Buddhist and Hindu religions separately refer to Agartha. The first public scientific evidence occurred in 1947 when Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd of the United States Navy flew directly to the North Pole and instead of going over the pole, actually entered the inner Earth. In his diary with other witnesses, he tells of entering the hollow earth of the Earth, the hollow interior of the Earth, and traveling 1,700 miles over mountains, lakes, rivers, green vegetation, and animal life. He tells of seeing monstrous animals resembling the mammoth of antiquity moving through the underbrush. He eventually found cities and a thriving civilization. His plane was finally greeted by flying machines, the type he had never seen before. They escorted him to a safe landing place, and he was graciously greeted by emissaries from Agartha. After resting, he and his crew were taken to meet the ruler of Agartha. They told him that he had been allowed to enter Agartha because of his high moral and ethical character. They went on to say that ever since the United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they had been very concerned for their own safety and survival. They had decided that it was time to make greater contact with the outside world to make sure we didn't destroy this planet and their civilization with it. They had been allowed in for this express purpose as a way of making contact with someone they trusted. To make a long story short, Admiral Byrd and his crew upon their visit were guided by their hosts in their plane back to the outer world, and their lives were changed forever. In January 1956, Admiral Byrd led another expedition to the Antarctic and/or the South Pole. In this expedition, he and his crew penetrated for 2,300 miles into the center of Earth again. Admiral Byrd states that the North and South Pole are actually two of many openings to the center of Earth. I can't help but think about Jules Verne's famous science fiction book, Journey to the Center of the Earth, which many of you may have read or watched the movie version. Admiral Byrd also states inner Earth has an inner sun. Admiral Byrd's theory is that the poles of the Earth are convex rather than concave. Ships and planes can actually fly or drive right in. The American press announced Admiral Byrd's discovery, however, it was immediately suppressed by our good friends, the secret government. Ray Palmer, the editor of Flying Saucer magazine, did a detailed story on Admiral Byrd's discoveries. The United States government either bought, stole, or destroyed almost every copy and destroyed the plates at the printing press. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, we're going to do a dedicated episode on Admiral Byrd and this whole situation and cover up if there was one. Needless to say, it's highly disputed, Admiral Byrd's account. People who buy into the flat earth theory believe that Antarctica is just a large piece of land as an outer circle going for possibly infinite space. So it wasn't necessarily hollow earth that Admiral Byrd flew over, but these 2,300 miles that are mentioned, or in his interview, if you check out Admiral Byrd's interview, he actually did a TV interview where a video recorded radio interview where he actually mentioned that Antarctica was larger than the space of North America. Obviously, if you look up the mileage and if you look on Google Earth, that doesn't even make any kind of sense. So the flat earthers assume this means some kind of an incredibly large plain, but it could just mean that Antarctica is a lot bigger than claimed, or, of course, this hollow earth theory. I have been told that the exact same thing happened in respect to an article done on Admiral Byrd's discovery by National Geographic. The magazine was released and the US government gobbled up almost every issue. If the story wasn't true, how come the government was so uptight? Another interesting fact is that the United States government does not let planes fly over the poles. All flights are directed to go around the poles, and any airline pilot flying in these areas will tell you this. Another interesting phenomenon is the fact that the icebergs are composed of fresh water and not salt water that drift from the poles. Another interesting question is, why is it warmer near the poles than it is 600 to 1,000 miles away from them? In Dr. Raymond Bernard's book called The Hollow Earth, he tells of a man who confirmed Admiral Byrd's story. Dr. Nephi Cotton of Los Angeles reported that one of his patients, a man of Nordic descent, told him the following story. I lived near the Arctic Circle in Norway. One summer, my friend and I made up our minds to take a boat trip together and go as far as we could go into the North Country. So we put a month's worth of food, provisions in a small fishing boat and set to sea. At the end of 1 month, we had traveled far into the north beyond the pole and into a strange new country. We were much astonished at the weather there. Warm, and at times at night it was almost too warm to sleep. Then we saw something so strange that we were both astonished. Ahead of the warm open sea, we were on what looked like a great mountain. Into that mountain, at a certain point, that ocean seemed to be emptying. Mystified, we continued in that direction and found ourselves sailing into a vast canyon leading into the interior of the earth. We kept sailing, and then we saw what surprised us: a sun shining inside the earth. The ocean that had carried us into the hollow interior of the earth gradually became a river. This river led, as we came to realize later, all through the inner surface of the world, from one end to the other. It can take you, if you follow it long enough, from the North Pole clear through to the South Pole. We saw that the inner surface of the earth was divided, as the other one is, into both land and water. There is plenty of sunshine, and both animal and vegetable life abound there. We sailed further and further into this fantastic country. Fantastic because everything was huge in size as compared with things on the outside. Plants are big, trees gigantic, and finally, we came to giants. They were dwelling in homes and towns just as we do on the Earth's surface, and they used a type of electrical conveyance like a monorail car to transport people. It ran along the river's edge from town to town. Several of the inner earth inhabitants, huge giants, detected our boat on the river and were quite amazed. They were, however, quite friendly. We were invited to dine with them in their homes, and so my companion and I separated, he going with one giant to that giant's home, and I going with another giant to his home. All right, hold on a second. So, if you and your friend went to some kind of strange land, would you separate from each other? I don't know. That's a red flag for me. The other thing is, I don't necessarily think a lot of these people that have these fantastical stories are lying. How do we know that these guys just didn't have some kind of magic mushroom trip and then went sailing? So they believe everything that happened. And maybe it did happen in another dimension. Maybe they astral traveled. Who knows? But there are other possibilities. We're not going for black and white fallacies here. There are other possibilities than this story being exactly true as described with no other factors coming into play. There could be plenty of more variables at play here. But continuing on, my gigantic friend brought me home to his family, and I was completely dismayed to see the huge size of all of the objects in his home. The dinner table was colossal. A plate was put before me and filled with a portion of food so big it would have fed me abundantly an entire week. The giant offered me a cluster of grapes, and each grape was as big as one of our peaches. I tasted one and found it far sweeter than any I had ever tasted outside. That actually sounds kind of good. A gigantic grape the size of a peach. Yeah, it sounds pretty good. In the interior of the earth, all the fruits and vegetables taste far better and more flavorsome than those we have on the outer surface of the earth. We stayed with the giants for 1 year, enjoying their companionship as much as they enjoyed knowing us. We observed many strange and unusual things during our visit with these remarkable people and were continually amazed at their scientific progress and inventions. All of the time, they were never unfriendly to us, and we were allowed to return to our own home in the same manner in which we came. In fact, they courteously offered their protection if we should need it for the return voyage. That's pretty interesting. Why would they need protection? Another different account about a visit to Hollow Earth was cited by another Norwegian by the name of Olaf Jansen and was recorded in a book called The Smoky God, written by Willis George Emerson. This is the more famous account. The previous one, I believe, is relatively obscure and not as well known. The term smoky god refers to the central sun in the hollow interior of the earth, which is smaller and less brilliant than our outer sun, of course, and hence appears as smoky. The book relates the experiences of a Norse father and son who in their small fishing boat attempted to find the land beyond the north wind, which they had heard about. A windstorm apparently carried them through the polar opening into the hollow interior of the earth. The book was published in 1908. It tells of the son's experiences. They apparently spent 2 years there, and upon returning through the south polar opening, the father lost his life when an iceberg broke in two and destroyed the boat. The son was rescued and told his incredible story. He was placed in prison for the insane because no one would believe him. After being released and spending 26 years as a fisherman, he moved to the U.S. In his 90s, he befriended Willis George Emerson and told him his story. On his deathbed, he also gave him maps that he had made of the interior of the earth and the manuscript of his experiences. The book, The Smoky God, tells of his experiences. In the book, he said that people live from 400 to 800 years and are highly advanced in science. They can transmit their thoughts from one to another by certain types of radiations and have sources of power greater than our electricity. They are the creators of flying saucers, which are operated by this superior power drawn from the electromagnetism of the atmosphere. They are 12 or more feet in stature. One other interesting side note is that in 1942, Nazi Germany sent out an expedition composed of some of its leading scientists in an attempt to find an entrance to the Hollow Earth. Goering, Himmler, and Hitler enthusiastically endorsed the project. The Fuhrer was convinced that the Earth was concaved and that men lived on the inside of the globe. In The Hollow Earth, Raymond Bernard also tells of a photograph published in 1960 in the Toronto, Canada Globe and Mail, which shows a beautiful valley with lush green hills. An aviator claimed that the picture had been taken from his airplane as he flew beyond the North Pole. Okay, so there is an archive of Globe and Mail in Toronto, Canada, that newspaper. So Raymond Bernard is talking about a photo that was published in 1960. He does not give the date. I've looked a bit, and I cannot find the photo that they're talking about here. So someone's saying that there's a photograph showing beautiful valleys with lush green hills beyond the poles or whatnot. I mean, we're going to need that photograph, so it seems like nobody's found it yet. You'd have to go through about a year's worth of newspaper articles from this newspaper. Be an interesting thing to do. I mean, it'd be helpful if he gave this aviator's name, but... Okay, here's the exact quote from the book, The Hollow Earth. Some time ago, a newspaper in Toronto... Oh, it doesn't say 19... Oh, yeah, it does. Okay. Some time ago, a newspaper in Toronto, Canada, the Globe and Mail, published a photo of a green valley taken by an aviator in the Arctic region. Evidently, the aviator took the picture from the air and did not attempt to land. It was a beautiful valley and contained rolling green hills. The aviator must have gone beyond the North Pole into the same warmer territory that Admiral Byrd visited, which lies inside the polar opening. This picture was published in 1960. Okay, so no name of the aviator, no date of the newspaper. I don't know. That's not cutting it for me. I don't like that. All right, moving on back to this. The channelings of Djwal Khul on the Hollow Earth. Whenever I do research on a given subject, I like to get Djwal Khul's feedback on the information I have come up with. Upon sharing with him what I have shared with you in this book, he had a number of interesting things to add. First off, he confirmed that Admiral Byrd did indeed travel to the inner Earth as he said he did. He said that there is a sun in the inner Earth, but it is different than our outer sun. He said that the aurora borealis was not caused by the sun of the inner Earth, but from a different light source. He said that the opening at the poles were very wide and ships and planes can fly into it. However, it is naturally protected by some kind of an energy field. People can find it if they really search for it. However, it is slightly camouflaged by this energy field. He confirmed that there were entrances to the inner Earth in Egypt, Tibet, and the Yucatan, and also added that there were other entrances, the Bermuda Triangle, Soviet Union, and Africa. He said that there were different races in inner Earth, just like on the surface of the Earth, and some of them are quite tall. He also confirmed that the United States government and other countries are aware of the inner Earth and are covering up the fact as they are with UFOs and extraterrestrials. And this is from Dr. Joshua David Stone. So he's channeling this Djwal Khul character. And just for those that don't know, Djwal Khul is believed by some theosophists and others to be a Tibetan disciple in the tradition of ancient esoteric spirituality known as the Ageless Wisdom tradition. So this relates to the ascended masters and such. Okay, let's move on to Tibetan Buddhism. In Tibetan Buddhist traditions, Shambhala is a mystical kingdom hidden somewhere beyond the snow peaks of the Himalayas. It is mentioned in various ancient texts, including the Kalachakra and the ancient texts of the Zhang-Zung culture, which predated Tibetan Buddhism in Western Tibet. The Bon scriptures speak of a closely related land called Almalungring. Shambhala in the Buddhist Kalachakra teachings. The Kalachakra Mandala. Buddha prophesied that all who received the Kalachakra's empowerment would take rebirth in its mandala of consciousness. The kingdom of Shambhala takes a central place in the Kalachakra teachings. Shambhala is a Sanskrit term meaning place of peace, tranquility, and happiness. Shakyamuni Buddha is said to have taught the Kalachakra Tantra on request of King Suchandra. Also, the teachings are said to be preserved there. Shambhala is said to be a society where all the inhabitants are enlightened, centered around a capital city called Kalapa. War and injustice are said to be unknown there. It is said to be populated by beautiful women and men dwelling in magnificent abodes. Shambhala is ruled over by the Kulika or Kalki king. The Kulika or Kalki king, a benevolent monarch who upholds the integrity of the Kalachakra Tantra. Religious scholars believe that this figure developed out of the myth of the Hindu conqueror Kalki, a similar personage. The Kalachakra prophesies that when the world declines into war and greed and all is lost, the 25th Kalika king will emerge, or the 2050 Kalika king will emerge from Shambhala with a huge army to vanquish the corrupt world rulers and usher in a worldwide golden age. Some scholars put this date at 2424 AD. I guess they're saying no matter how bad it is now, it could get worse, and it could get a whole lot worse. You know what else is interesting? I've seen theories, I will be going into them in other podcasts, where some of these prophesized dates already occurred. And whatever actions occurred were what was being prophesized, if that is already true. So this already, in this theory, certain events would have already passed, and we are living beyond them. As with many concepts in Vajrayana Buddhism, the idea of Shambhala is said to have an outer, inner, and secret meaning. The outer meaning understands Shambhala to exist as a physical place, although only individuals with the appropriate karma can reach it and experience it as such. There are various ideas about where this society is located, but it is often placed in Central Asia north of Tibet. The inner and secret meanings refer to more subtle understandings of what Shambhala represents and are generally passed on orally. The Western fascination with Shambhala. During the 19th century, Theosophical Society founder H.P. Blavatsky alluded to the Shambhala myth, giving it currency for Western occult enthusiasts. Later, esoteric writers further emphasized and elaborated on the concept of a hidden land, inhabited by a hidden mystic brotherhood whose members labor for the good of humanity. The myths of Shambhala were part of the inspiration for the tale of Shangri-La told in the popular book Lost Horizon, and thus some people even refer to Shambhala improperly as if it were Shangri-La. Shambhala's location and nature remains a subject of much dispute, and several traditions have arisen as to where it is or will be, including those that emphasize it as a non-physical realm that one can only approach it through the mind. Ancient Zhangzhung texts identify Shambhala with the Sutlej Valley in Himachal Pradesh. Mongolians identify Shambhala with certain valleys of southern Siberia. Beginning in the 1960s, various occult writers have sought to explain the evil of Nazism by suggesting Adolf Hitler tapped into the malevolent forces of Shambhala when he sent Ahnenerbe researchers to Tibet to measure Tibetan skulls as part of his master race justifications. Also known that Joseph Stalin organized an expedition to find Shambhala. These are very, very interesting historical events, are they not? Western esoteric traditions. Helena Blavatsky, who claimed to be in contact with a great white lodge of Himalayan adepts, mentions Shambhala in several places without giving it especially great emphasis. The Mahatmas, we are told, were also active around Shingatse and Luxor. Blavatsky's Shambhala, like the headquarters of the Great White Lodge, is a physical location on our earth, albeit one which can only be penetrated by a worthy aspirant. Later esoteric writers like Alice Bailey of the Arcane School and the Roriks Agni Yoga do emphasize Shambhala. Bailey transformed it into a kind of extra-dimensional or spiritual reality. The Roriks see its existence as both spiritual and physical. Related hidden land speculations surrounding the underground kingdom of Agartha led some early 20th century occultists to view Shambhala as a source of rather negative manipulation by an evil or amoral conspiracy. Nevertheless, the predominant theme is one of light and hope, as evidenced by James Redfield's and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's respective books by that name. In neo-Nazi mysticism, Shambhala is sometimes supposed to be the place to which Adolf Hitler fled after the fall of the Third Reich. Hitler was known to have an interest in the myth of Shambhala and in Eastern mysticism generally, from which he appropriated the swastika. Very, very interesting. Of course, going back to all these differences in Mongolians, Tibetans, all of these areas, they're saying Shambhala, they're associating Shambhala with different physical locations. Is this similar to some kind of Atlantis situation? Or maybe it's both. Maybe it's not really even a comparison, because if the Atlanteans are the Shambhala inhabitants, it's the same thing. But on the surface level, Atlantis is a myth that just won't die, and it's everywhere in every ancient culture, and also linked to the Great Flood myth. So if Atlantis was a worldwide civilization, perhaps Shambhala is also a worldwide and doesn't have one specific place, which is interesting, or Agartha. So that's pretty interesting. Shangri-La, Agartha, Shambhala, whatever word we're using to describe this realm. If it is in multiple locations, does that explain these different ancient cultures having different physical locations for it? Similarly to Atlantis on the surface. Okay, here is another very interesting article. This was posted by Muriel Rohn on November 15th, 2015. in etheric retreats, ascension seats, sacred sites, underground cities, temples of light, ley lines, and more. Okay. Shambhala, 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 Sambhala, Shangri-La. Sambhala, the evolution of a myth. Shambhala is the stuff of legend and myth, the Shangri-La that humanity longs for in its collective consciousness. Many believe that it is a physical place hidden behind distant snow-capped mountains north of the Himalayas, not far from the Gobi Desert, where inhabitants live in peace and harmony and enjoy long life and near physical perfection. Shambhala is reputably ruled by a line of enlightened kings who are said to be guarding the highest wisdom that humanity has managed to obtain. Legend has it that Shambhala, along with the location of the place, has been hidden because we are so wicked. But that when humanity is ready, a great king will come out of the sanctuary to defeat the forces of evil and establish a golden age. I can't help but think, linking this to even the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, with wickedness, so before the fall, the golden age, even if we go into the rule of the Titans in Greek mythology, the golden age of man under the Titans before the gods, we have these reoccurring themes everywhere, and that's what makes this so interesting. Tibetans, including the present Dalai Lama, note the huge number of teachings which have purportedly come out of Shambhala and ask, how could the country be just a fantasy? The famous Kalachakra teachings contain sermons given by the Buddha and include descriptions of the role Shambhala will play in the future, supposedly came out of Shambhala. Everyone has different images of this mythical dream, each based on our own perceptions, beliefs, and the conditioning which limit our knowledge and our imagination. In popular New Age esoteric wisdom, Shambhala is the center where the will of God is known, the planet's head center. Some say it is found in the Gobi Desert in etheric matter over the White Island. For some, Shambhala is the heavenly field to be aspired to, the reward for a life after martyrdom and service. For anyone who has read some of the philosophy and psychology of Buddhism and do not just rely on the New Age esoterica of the modern theosophy movement, it can be easily seen how these hopes, dreams, and perceptions evolved. It is not only Christianity that refers to the three manifestations or the three bodies. The Buddhist model refers to the three kayas, the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya, often referred to as the bodies of the Buddha. Translation into and the influence of the Western spiritualism hierarchy model has seen those portrayed as a linear progression rather than something that is more like water with salt dissolved in it. It can easily be seen how from these roots, the popular terms Dharma, Shambhala, there are about 5 different spellings of this that I have found, Nirvana have been derived as evolutionary terms to suit models of belief which fit in and are perhaps more acceptable to those who are brought up in the Western religious tradition. The Dharmakaya is something that is always present. It is rediscovered rather than created anew. It is timeless and not limited by history. It is the energy of life itself, the fire that burns but does not burn itself, passive and indeterminate in nature. Dharmakaya, however, gives rise to the deterministic aspects of Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya. Here is the metaphor is identical to the Taoist philosophy. Sambhogakaya is always present. It is the state of personal consciousness where one's mind is tuned into Dharmakaya and becomes the expression of the wisdom of all life. It is connected with the ability to communicate on all levels, both verbal and nonverbal, and thus associated with the concept of relating and relationships. This is the common sense of our cell, beyond anything the mind might want to think. From this, it should be easy to see where the mythical dream of Shangri-La and Shambhala originates, the revelations from man's unconscious that have been projected out there. It is only on the physical level that one can become transformed. There are many variations of the spelling of this archetype of human consciousness, including Shambhala, Shambhala, Sambhala, Shambhala, and Sambhala. Nirmanakaya is the physical embodiment and expression of total realization of one's common sense. To remove the mystical terminology, in Nirmanakaya, the realization of nirvana, one becomes the medium through which communication and relating can be carried out. One becomes the medium. Very interesting. Shambhala is us here now, the magical expression of the open mind and open heart, but we are so busy looking with our linear minds for something up there or out there, for salvation from some male or female supernatural being, that we have forgotten that every time we do, that parasite of fear destroys a little more of the magic. Shambhala is the infinitude of who we are, the magical natural being in our own heart intelligence. Yeah, that's a very interesting article. Some might find it incredibly new agey, but I thought that was kind of interesting since we really don't know that much about how the human mind works and consciousness itself. Modern science doesn't know anywhere near as much as it purports to, and even if we assume a lot of it is true, that's all less than 1% of what there is to know, infinitely less. So, yeah, very, very interesting. So in this model, Shambhala is a projection of the human mind. Shambhala is an idea, is a concept, is a spiritual concept. So let's get a little bit more technical about Shambhala. So this article is referencing Shambhala as being the Sanat Kumara's retreat, the city built for him by his 144,000 followers who came to Earth with him to help hold the light for survival. Once again, we see that 144,000 number. That's an interesting number, isn't it? So here is this particular story. Shambhala, the ancient retreat of Sanat Kumara and Gautama Buddha. Sanat Kumara, the ancient of days. Shambhala, the ancient home of Sanat Kumara and Gautama Buddha, is located in the etheric realm over the Gobi Desert in China. This retreat, once physical, has since been withdrawn to the etheric octave, or heaven world. Retreat built as part of Sanat Kumara's rescue mission. The retreat was originally built for Sanat Kumara, hierarch of Venus, who long ago came to Earth in her darkest hour when all light had gone out in her evolutions and there was not a single individual on the planet who gave adoration to the God presence or the inner Buddha. Sanat Kumara was accompanied on the mission by a band of 144,000 souls of light, who with him had volunteered to keep the flame of life on behalf of Earth's people. This they vowed to do until the children of God who had been turned away from their first love by fallen angels would respond to the love of God and turn once again to serve their mighty I Am presence. 400 who formed the avant-garde went before Sanat Kumara to build on the White Island in the brilliant blue Gobi Sea, where the Gobi Desert is now, the magnificent retreat that was to become for all time the legendary Shambhala. This city was originally a physical replica of the Venusian city of the Kumaras. The volunteers from Venus focused here the 144 virtues of the flames of the elements, composing a diamond replica of the focus in the great hub. The city of White was approached from the mainland by a beautiful marble bridge. Shambhala's main temple and altar of the threefold flame. The main temple of Shambhala is marked by a golden dome and is surrounded by terraces, flame fountains, and 7 temples, one for each of the 7 rays, situated on a wide avenue resembling the Champs-Élysées, lined with trees and flowers, flame fountains, and tropical birds, including bluebirds of happiness. The altar of the threefold flame is the main temple, where the star of Sanat Kumara is hung from the ceiling over the altar. This, the principal focus of the threefold flame upon the planet, was established by Sanat Kumara when he came long ago. Through it, he connected a ray from his heart to every life stream evolving on the planet, and thus assisted their holy Christ selves to raise mankind's consciousness back to the place where they could be taught the laws of self-mastery. The tradition of the Yule log In past ages, people would come each year for many miles to witness the visible, physical, sacred fire and to take home a place of wood consecrated by Sanat Kumara to light their fires through the coming year. Thus began the tradition of the Yule log, commemorating the return to the fire of Christhood. Sanat Kumara founded the activities of the Great White Brotherhood on the planetary level, and their headquarters remain here today. Here, the masters train messengers to go forth with the teachings of the Christ, adapted to every level of human consciousness. Each year, the fruits of all endeavors made by angels, elementals, and representatives of the Brotherhood in the world of form are returned to Shambhala in the fall and are brought to the feet of the Lord of the world. The angels come on St. Michael's Day, September 29th. The elementals come at the end of October, and representatives of the Brotherhood at the end of November, when in America the Feast of Gratitude is celebrated at Thanksgiving. Legends of Shambhala. Gautama Buddha retreat at Shambhala, the legend of the East. Shambhala is the name of a mythical kingdom, an earthly paradise, said to exist somewhere between the Himalayas and the Gobi Desert. Ancient Tibetan texts describe the kingdom as a beautiful place in an inaccessible part of Asia, formed of 8 regions, each surrounded by a ring of snow-capped mountains and therefore looking like an 8-petaled blossom. It is an idyllic country, free of strife and crime, whose inhabitants have attained great spiritual developments and powers. So right before Legends of Shambhala is celebrated at Thanksgiving. So wow, that is a very interesting claim that Venusian entities came and created Shambhala and kind of create Christ-type messengers for the world. Very interesting. Very, very interesting concepts. So, legends of Shambhala have attained great spiritual development and powers. The kingdom of Shambhala plays a central role in Tibetan Buddhism. Author Edwin Birnbaum writes that the sacred texts of the Tibetans speak of Shambhala as a mystical kingdom hidden behind snow peaks somewhere north of Tibet. There, a line of enlightened kings is supposed to be guarding the most secret teachings of Buddhism for a time when all truth in the world outside is lost in war and the lust for power and wealth. Then, according to prophecy, a future king of Shambhala will come out with a great army to destroy the forces of evil and bring in a golden age. Under his enlightened rule, the world will become at last a place of peace and plenty, filled with the riches of wisdom and compassion. The texts add that a long and mystical journey across a wilderness of deserts and mountains leads to Shambhala. Whoever manages to reach this distant sanctuary, having overcome numerous hardships and obstacles along the way, will find there a secret teaching that will enable him to master time and liberate himself from its bondage. The texts warn, however, that only those who are called and have the necessary spiritual preparation will be able to get to Shambhala. Others will find only blinding storms and empty mountains, or even death. That's pretty interesting, though. Kind of like you can't really find it unless your soul is pure. I mean, that's kind of an ancient concept found in legends and mythologies all over the world. Gautama Buddha was the first initiate to serve under Sanat Kumara, hence the one chosen to succeed him in the office of the Lord of the World. On January 1st, 1956, Sanat Kumara placed his mantle on Lord Gautama, whereupon the Chele par excellence of the great guru also became the hierarch of Shambhala. Today, Gautama Buddha sustains the tide to the threefold flames of all mankind. It will be sustained until each individual makes his ascension in the light. Sanat Kumara, retaining the title of Regent Lord of the World, returned to Venus and to his twin flame, Lady Master Venus, who had kept the home fires burning during his long exile. There he continued his service with the Great White Brotherhood and the advanced evolutions of his home star on behalf of planet Earth. Call to be taken to Shambhala with Lord Gautama Buddha. Call in the name of your own Christ self to Lord Gautama Buddha to invoke assistance on your spiritual path following the heart of the Buddha and your own inner Buddha. So now let's take a look at more historical context after that incredibly spiritual analysis and see what certain governments thought of Shambhala at certain times in history. So this was written by Alexander Berzin, April 2003. The role of Shambhala legend in Russian and Japanese involvement with pre-communist Tibet. Badmayev's proposals for Russian annexation of Tibet. The Manchu Qing dynasty of China, 1644 to 1911, declined during the 19th century. Many countries sought to take advantage of its weakness to gain either trade or territorial concessions. They included not only Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal, but also Russia and Japan. For example, in 1893, the Buryat Mongol physician Pyotr Badmaev submitted a plan to Tsar Alexander III for bringing parts of the Qing Empire under Russian sway, including Outer and Inner Mongolia and Tibet. He proposed extending the Trans-Siberian Railway from the Buryat homeland at Lake Baikal through Outer and Inner Mongolia in Gansu, China, next to the Tibetan border. When completed, he would organize, with Buryat help, an uprising in Tibet that would allow Russia to annex the country. Badmaev also proposed establishing a Russian trading company in Asia. Count Sergei Yulgevich Witt, Russian finance minister from 1882 to 1903, supported Badmaev's two plans, but Tsar Alexander accepted neither of them. Upon the death of Alexander, Badmaev became the personal physician of his successor, Tsar Nicholas II, who reigned from 1894 to 1917. Soon, the new Tsar approved the funding of a trading company. Its focus, however, was the Pacific coast, where Russia and Japan competed for control of Port Arthur, an ice-free port at the southern tip of Manchuria. At first, Japan gained Port Arthur, but soon Russia took over. The Tsar extended the Trans-Siberian Railroad through northern Manchuria to Vladivostok and connected it to Port Arthur. Nicholas, however, did not take up Badmaev's proposals concerning Tibet. Dorjiev and Tsar Nicholas II. The Buryat Mongol monk Agvan Dorjiev, 1854 to 1938, studied in Lhasa, Tibet from 1880 and eventually became one of the master debate partners, assistant tutors, of the 13th Dalai Lama. He also became the Dalai Lama's most trusted political advisor. The Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1890 had established Sikkim as a British protectorate. The Tibetans did not acknowledge the convention and were uncomfortable with both British and Chinese designs on their country. Thus, in 1899, Dorjiev visited Russia to see if he could secure help to counter these threats. Dorjiev was a friend of Badmaev and hoped that Russia's expansionist policy in Northeast Asia at the expense of China would extend to the Himalayan region. Count Witt received him on this and his next several visits. On behalf of the Buryat and Kalmyk Mongols living in St. Petersburg, Dorjiev also petitioned permission for building a Kalachakra temple there. Although the Russian authorities were not interested in either proposal, Dorjiev sent a letter to the Dalai Lama reporting that the prospects of assistance looked hopeful. At first, the Dalai Lama and his ministers were hesitant, but on his return to Lhasa, Dorjiev convinced the Dalai Lama to turn to Russia for protection. He argued that Russia was the northern kingdom of Shambhala, the legendary land that safeguarded the Kalachakra teachings, and that Tsar Nicholas II was the incarnation of Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelug tradition. As evidence, he pointed to the Tsar's protection of the Gelug tradition among the Buryats, Kalmyks, Tuvinian Turks in the Russian Empire. Swayed by his argument, the Dalai Lama dispatched him back to Russia in 1900. At that time, Prince Esper Ukhotomsky was the head of the Russian Department of Foreign Creeds. The prince was deeply interested in Lamaist culture and wrote several books about it. He invited Dorjiev to meet the Tsar, who was the first of several audiences that Dorjiev had on behalf of the Dalai Lama. In the following years, Dorjiev traveled back and forth several times between the Tsar and Dalai Lama. He was never able, however, to secure Russian military support for Tibet. In Sturm Ber Asien, Storm over Asia, 1924, the German secret agent Wilhelm Filchner wrote that between 1900 and 1902, there was a large drive in St. Petersburg to secure Tibet for Russia. This drive, however, seemed to have been restricted to the efforts of Dorjiev with the support of Badmaev and Witt. The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, an ardent admirer of Germany, had an audience with Tsar Nicholas II en route back to Europe from his second Tibetan expedition, 1899 to 1902. Later, he wrote that he had the impression that Prince Ukhtomsky was pushing the Tsar to make Tibet a Russian protectorate. The prince's writings, however, reveal no such interest. Intrigues between Japan, Russia, Britain, and China and their effect on Tibet. The Japanese Zen priest Ikai Kawaguchi visited Tibet from 1900 to 1902 to collect Sanskrit and Tibetan Buddhist texts. On his return through British India, he falsely reported a Russian military presence in Tibet to Sarat Chandra Das, an Indian spy for the British who had visited Tibet in 1879 and 1881. This all sounds like it'd make a really good movie. Japan at the time was preparing for war with Russia over Manchuria. It had recently signed with Britain the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, 1902 to 1907, under which both sides agreed to remain neutral if the other were at war. By fomenting discord between England and Russia, it seems as though the Japanese priest was trying to ensure that Britain would not support Russia in their upcoming war. He probably also was hoping that British protests over Tibet would distract Russia's attention from Manchuria. In his book, 3 Years in Tibet, published in Benares by the Theosophical Society in 1909, Kawaguchi reported that he had heard of Dorjiev's pamphlet in Tibetan, Mongolian, and Russian, claiming that Russia was Shambhala and the Tsar was the incarnation of Tsongkhapa. He, however, had never personally seen it. Kawaguchi also spoke of a Japanese-Tibetan Buddhist coalition, but neither side ever drew plans to implement it. Kawaguchi's report and later his book became well known among the British authorities in India. Sir Charles Bell, British political officer in Sikkim, for example, cited it in Tibet Past and Present, 1924. He wrote that the Dorjiev had swayed the Dalai Lama to Russia's side by telling him how Russia controlled and protected part of Mongolia, Buryatia, how increasingly more Russians were embracing Tibetan Buddhism, and how the Tsar was likely to embrace it too. Lord Curzon, the British Viceroy of India at the time of Kawaguchi's report, was extremely paranoid of the Russians. Fearing a Russian takeover and monopoly of the Tibetan trade, he ordered the British invasion of Tibet with the Young Husband Expedition, 1903-1904. Together with Dorjiev, the Dalai Lama fled to Urga, Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. After surrendering defeat, the Tibetan regent signed the Lhasa or Lhasa Convention in 1904, acknowledging British control of Sikkim and granting the British trade relations and stationing of troops and officials in Lhasa or Lhasa to protect the Trade Commission. A few months later, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, broke out in Manchuria, in which the Japanese defeated the Tsar's forces. The Dalai Lama stayed on in Mongolia since, in 1906, the British and Chinese signed a convention reaffirming Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. Suzerainty over Tibet. The convention quickly prompted a Chinese attempt to annex Tibet. The Dalai Lama sent Dorjiev once more to the Russian court to seek military aid. In 1907, Dorjiev submitted a report to P.P. Semyonov Tianshansky, the vice president of the Russian Geographic Society, entitled On a Rapprochement Between Russia, Mongolia, and Tibet. In it, he called for the unification of the three states to create a great Buddhist confederacy. The Russian authorities flatly rejected it. In the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, Britain and Russia agreed to stay out of Tibet's internal affairs and deal only through China. Undaunted, Dorjiev petitioned the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1908, at least to build a Kalachakra temple in St. Petersburg, which the authorities had rejected when he had first proposed it in 1899. This time, however, the Tsar approved the plan. That was in 1909. The Dalai Lama returned briefly to Lhasa at the end of 1909, but Chinese troops soon arrived. In 1910, the Dalai Lama fled to India, where he stayed in Darjeeling, just south of Sikkim under British protection. There he befriended Sir Charles Bell, who influenced him about modernization. Events following the Chinese Nationalist Revolution of 1911. In 1911 to 1912, the Manchu Qing dynasty of China fell. The new president of the Chinese Nationalist Republic, Yan Zikai, continued the Manchu expansionist policy toward Tibet and welcomed the Dalai Lama to join the motherland. The Dalai Lama refused and cut off all ties with China. He created a war department to lead an armed rebellion against the Chinese. Due primarily to the chaotic situation in China, the Chinese troops soon surrendered. As soon as the soldiers left Tibet in early 1913, the Dalai Lama returned to Lhasa. Later in 1913, the first public ceremony took place at the St. Petersburg Kalachakra Temple, a long life prayer to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the House of Romanov. The Dalai Lama sent congratulatory gifts, and rumors spread that he had recognized Alexis, the heir apparent, as a bodhisattva who would enlighten the non-Buddhists of the north. Still, however, no military aid was forthcoming from the Romanovs. After driving back the Chinese forces from sections of Kham in southeastern Tibet, the Tibetans negotiated the Simla Convention of 1914 with the British. Since the British would not support the complete independence of Tibet, the Dalai Lama compromised. The British guaranteed Tibetan autonomy under only nominal Chinese suzerainty. The British also agreed that they would not annex Tibet and would not allow China to do so either. The Chinese never signed the convention, and in continuing border skirmishes with the Chinese in Kham, the British never came to the aid of the Tibetans. The Dalai Lama began to look elsewhere for support. Tibet receives Japanese military guidance. The Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War had impressed the Dalai Lama. He now became interested in the Meiji Restoration and modernization of Japan as a model for the modernization of Tibet within a Buddhist framework. Therefore, in the face of a continuing Chinese military threat and lack of Russian or British support, Tibet turned to Japan to update the Tibetan army. Especially keen on establishing a close connection with Japan was Sarong, the head of the Tibetan Mint and Armory and the Dalai Lama's favorite. Yajima Yasujiro, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, came to Lhasa and from 1913 to 1919 trained troops and advised on defense against the Chinese. Aoki Bunkyo, a Japanese Buddhist priest, translated Japanese army manuals into Tibetan. He also helped design the Tibetan national flag by adding to traditional Tibetan symbols a rising sun surrounded by rays. This motif comprised the Japanese cavalry and infantry flags of the day and later became the design for the Japanese Navy and Army flag during World War II. The Dalai Lama was unsuccessful, however, in securing further Japanese military support. In 1919, the Japanese army became deeply engaged in suppressing an independence movement in Korea, which Japan had annexed in 1910. Then in the 1920s, Japan turned its attention more towards Manchuria and Mongolia and remained uninterested in Tibet only for Buddhist scholarly studies. The last Japanese left Tibet in 1923 when the Great Kanto earthquake destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama. The next year, the British established a police force in Lhasa. A clash occurred between the police and the Tibetan military, resulting in the death of one policeman. Sarong severely punished the murderer, but the anti-modernization faction in the Tibetan government used this as a pretext to turn the Dalai Lama against him. They pointed out that Sarong had acted without the Dalai Lama's consent, and they accused the military of plotting to take over the government. The Dalai Lama demoted Sarong in 1925 from his position as commander-in-chief of the army and dismissed him from the cabinet in 1930. Thus, the main Tibetan proponent of Japanese alliance was silenced. In December 1933, the Dalai Lama passed away. Tibet did not resume contact with Japan until 1938, when Sarong re-emerged to play a role in dealing with an official expedition from Japan's allies against the spread of international communism the Germans. So the article's pretty long and extensive. It goes into the political dealings, but the main underlying point of all this is the interest in Tibet, Buddhism, and possibly Shambhala. All these countries and governments, they seem to be very interested in this location and the Dalai Lama. So an unexplored aspect of Hollow Earth and Shambhala or Agartha mysticism is this connection to the Dalai Lama and all of this interpolitical play in this area throughout this time period. So there was also renewed Tibetan interest in Japan and contact with Nazi Germany. The end of the article states this: Hitler became a chancellor of Germany in 1933, the same year as the death of the 13th Dalai Lama. A lot of coincidences here. Here comes numerology. In the face of border skirmishes between Manchukuo and Outer Mongolia and the stationing of Soviet troops in the latter, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany in November 1936. The pact declared their mutual hostility toward the spread of international communism. They agreed that neither would make a political treaty with the Soviet Union, and if the Soviets attacked either, they would consult on what measures to take to safeguard their interests. In 1937, Japan took the western half of Inner Mongolia and northern China. Germany annexed Austria and part of Czechoslovakia in the same year. With Stalin's purges at their height, Chinese intentions of a military presence in Tibet as a prelude to annexation, and British diffidence to offer substantial help, Tibet once more looked elsewhere for military assistance and protection. The most reasonable alternative was Japan. Thus, in 1938, the Tibetan government, controlled now solely by the Reading regent, resumed contacts. Many Tibetans admired Japan as a Buddhist nation that had become a world power and a new patron of Buddhism, especially in Inner Mongolia. Moreover, the Japanese had helped to train the Tibetan army 20 years earlier. The Tibetan army manuals were translations from the Japanese. Japan, in turn, had a strategic interest in Tibet. As it expanded its greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, it saw Tibet as a useful and necessary buffer against British India. This fit well with Tibetan wish to remain independent from China. So again, within the scope of the Victor's Right to History books and all this information we have about these political processes in Tibet involving Japan, Russia, and Britain and China, it's all very, very interesting, because if the real reasons for all of this were Shambhala and some Hollow Earth connections, how would we know? Okay, we're going to briefly touch upon the Nazi expedition to Tibet. There'll be a dedicated episode going into all of these missions, secret not documents, and all that. This is just how it ties in with this. The Nazi expedition to Tibet. Because of the Japanese-German Anti-Comintern Pact, Tibet also thought to make official contact with the German government. The decision had nothing to do with support for Nazi ideology or policy, but was due to practical necessity and the vicissitudes of the times. The conservative Tibetan government, however, proceeded cautiously. It invited an exploratory delegation from the Nazi government to visit Tibet for the Losar, the New Year celebration, which led to the third Tibet expedition of Ernst Schoeffer in 1938 to 1939. The British objected, but the Tibetans ignored the protest. Schaefer was a hunter and biologist. His two previous expeditions to Tibet in 1931 to 1932 and 1934 to 1936 had been for sport and zoological research. The third expedition, however, was sent by the ANNERB, the Bureau for the Study of Ancestral Heritage. The Germans were not interested in offering military assistance or protection to Tibet. This is obvious from the choice of the members of the delegation. In addition to Schaefer, the team included an anthropologist, a geophysicist, a filmmaker, and a technical leader. Its primary mission seems to have been measuring the skulls of Tibetans in order to establish them as ancestors of the Aryans, and therefore acceptable as an intermediary race between the Germans and the Japanese. So, I mean, I think that was the public. I think that there's plenty of secret aspects to those missions, which we will be going over in later episodes. According to Nazi occult sources, the expedition was also seeking support for the Nazi cause from the Masters of Shambhala, who were the guardians of secret psychic powers. Shambhala refused to help, but the occult masters of the underground kingdom of Agartha agreed, and thousands of Tibetans went to Germany. These claims do not, however, seem to be fact. Although the Germans brought back with them numerous skulls for further study, none of their reports indicate that any Tibetans accompanied them to Germany. Moreover, no further German expeditions followed. Developments subsequent to the Schaefer expedition. Within a few months of the Schaefer expedition, the political and military landscapes changed dramatically. In May 1939, Japan invaded Outer Mongolia, where it faced stiff resistance from the Soviet army. While the battle was still raging in Mongolia, Hitler broke the anti-Comintern pact with Japan in August 1939 and signed the Nazi-Soviet pact to avoid war on two European fronts. The next month, he invaded Poland at about the same time as Japan was defeated in Mongolia. The events demonstrated to the Tibetans that neither Japan nor Germany was a reliable source of protection against the Soviets. Moreover, because Japan was making little headway in conquering the rest of China, it turned its attention instead to Indochina and the Pacific. Japan did not appear anymore as a protector against the Chinese. Thus, Tibet was left no choice but the British and the weak protection that the Simla Convention afforded her. In September 1940, Germany, Japan, and Italy signed a military and economic alliance. In September 1941, Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and attacked the Soviet Union. Neither event, however, swayed the Tibetans to reconsider seeking protection from the Axis powers. Tibet remained neutral during the Second World War. That's also pretty interesting. Very, very interesting. Japan's interest in Japan, however, continued and grew even stronger after its invasion of Burma at the start of 1942. Planning to enter Tibet through Upper Burma, the Japanese imperial government organized a Greater Asian Bureau. As its advisor for Tibetan affairs, the government approached Aoki Bunkyo. The government appointed Aoki Bunkyo, who 20 years earlier had translated Japanese army manuals into Tibetan. Under his guidance, the Japanese prepared maps and Tibetan-Japanese dictionaries. They even printed Tibetan money in anticipation of including Tibet in its co-prosperity sphere. With Japan's defeat in 1945, however, the Japanese were never able to implement their plans for Tibet. That's all very interesting how all these geopolitics fit in with all of this. So there's also interesting in the geopolitical aspect of all this, the exploitation of the Shambhala legend for control of Mongolia. So we have people claiming that the Soviet Union is Shambhala and all these things. It's kind of weird how these ancient mythologies and legends are used to exploit. And of course, we don't really know what went on behind the scenes, and we don't really know what happened, but this is on some of the records, so whether true, not true, accurate, or inaccurate, it's still kind of interesting how Shambhala fits into all of this. So this is an article by Alexander Berzin, April 2003, The Exploitation of the Shambhala Legend for Control of Mongolia. The division of Mongolia by foreign conquerors. The Manchus, Chinese, Russians, and Japanese have long competed for control of Northeast Asia, particularly of the Mongol regions. Since the days of Chinggis Khan and the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, all the nearby regional powers saw the Mongols as a potentially dangerous military force. It needed to be either neutralized by preventing Mongol unification or harnessed by promoting that unification. The Manchus created the division of Mongolia into outer and inner portions in 1636 when they captured Inner Mongolia and used it as a base for their conquest of China and establishment of the Qing dynasty 1644-1911. After winning control of Outer Mongolia in 1691, the Manchus maintained the artificial division of outer and inner to prevent the Mongols from uniting against them. That's an interesting strategy. divide and conquer. In 1729, Russia conquered and annexed Buryatia, the Mongol region north of Outer Mongolia near Lake Baikal, further weakening Mongol unification. The start of Chinese-Russian-Japanese rivalry in Northeast Asia. With the progressive decline of the Qing dynasty in the second half of the 19th century, various powers sought to take advantage and expand their political and commercial empires. They included not only European nations such as Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal, but also Asian powers. Let us look at the struggle between Russia and Japan over Manchuria, Mongols' neighbor to the east. Manchuria occupied a strategic position not only because of its ice-free ports on the southern coast along the Bohai Gulf, but also because it served the Qing or Qing emperors as a base for controlling Mongolia. The Japanese gained the Liaodong Peninsula of southern Manchuria with Port Arthur at its tip. With their victory in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, in 1896, Tsar Nicholas II forged an alliance with China against Japan and won the right to extend the Trans-Siberian Railway through northern Manchuria to connect with the Russian Pacific port of Vladivostok. In doing so, Russia gained nominal control of northern Manchuria. Subsequently, through intense pressure from Russia and China, the Japanese withdrew from southern Manchuria. At the other side of the mouth of the Bohai Gulf, opposite Port Arthur, lay the Shandong Peninsula. After Germany seized its major port, Tsingtao, in 1897, Russia demanded further concessions from the Chinese government. She was given control of Port Arthur and its Manchurian hinterland in 1898 and promptly connected it by rail to Vladivostok. Japan looked uneasily, anxious to reestablish a power base on the Asian mainland. The Russo-Japanese War broke out over Manchuria in 1904. When the Japanese won in 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth granted to them a long-term lease to Port Arthur, similar to what Britain had secured over Hong Kong and the new territories with the Second Convention of Peking in 1898. The Japanese and Russians both agreed to restore Manchuria to Chinese control, but looked on for any opportunity to take it once more. In 1910, Japan seized and annexed Korea, which bordered the Liaodong Peninsula to the east. The Shambhala War. At first, the Mongolian communist regime tolerated Buddhism, since monastic leaders such as Darva Bandita advocated a return to early Buddhist principles of simplicity. Similar to the revival of faith movement led by the Buryats in the Soviet Union, the Mongol monk tried to reconcile Buddhism with communist theory. The Buryat scholar Jamsaranov supported the Bandita in his efforts. From 1926, the pure Buddhism and renewal movements gained impetus in Mongolia. Stalin took control of the Soviet Union in 1928. When he began his collectivization and anti-religion campaigns in 1929, the Mongol communist regime followed suit. In 1929, the Seventh Party Congress condemned the Buddhist reconciliation movements and formally forbade the installation of a ninth Jebtsun Dampa, although the reincarnation had been found in Tibet. Inspired by Stalin's example, the party went even further and from 1930 to 1932 enforced a policy of fanatic collectivization and persecution of religion. Many monks, supported by Buryat intellectuals who had fled to Mongolia to avoid Stalin's policies, rebelled. Some sought the help of the Panchen Lama. Since 1924, the 9th Panchen Lama had been in China because of a dispute with the 13th Dalai Lama. The Panchen Lama was insisting on relative autonomy from Lhasa, exemption from taxes, and the right to have his own armed forces. The Chinese nationalist government had provided him with soldiers, but the Dalai Lama would not let him return to Tibet. Suspicious of Chinese intentions, the Mongol rebels asked the Panchen Lama to invade Mongolia with his Chinese army. liberate their people from communism, secure their northern border against the Soviets, and under Chinese suzerainty, install the ninth Jebtsundampa. They likened the Panchen Lama and his Chinese troops to the king of Shambhala and his brave army who would defeat the barbarian forces. Although the Panchen Lama sent a letter approving the revolt, he never went to Mongolia or sent military support. Nevertheless, the rebellion and ensuing savage battles took the name the Shambhala War. Meanwhile, Japan attacked northern China in 1931, and in 1932 established Manchukuo from the territory it had been controlling in Manchuria and eastern Inner Mongolia for many years. Stalin was paranoid that Japan would use Buddhism to penetrate further in Asia by making a common cause with the Buddhists in Buryatia and Outer Mongolia. Thus, he dispatched the Soviet army to Mongolia in 1932, not only to quash the rebellion and end the Shambhala War, but also to correct the leftist deviation of the Mongol Communist Party. Under Soviet direction, the party enacted a new turn policy from 1932 to 1934, easing off on its persecution of Buddhism. They even allowed the reopening of a number of monasteries. Stalin felt that if he alienated the Buddhists too much, they would turn more readily to Japan. Buddhism in Mongolia, however, did not recover. Japanese efforts to woo Mongolia. In 1934, Kirov, Stalin's second-in-command, was murdered. His assassination led to the Great Purges of 1934 to 1938 to eliminate all anti-Stalin elements. The purges extended to Mongolia and the Buddhists here. When border skirmishes broke out in 1935 between the Japanese forces in Manchukuo and the Soviet troops in Mongolia, Stalin accused the High Lamas in Buryatia and Mongolia of collaborating with the Japanese. To win the support of the Mongols, the Japanese were using the time-proven method of claiming that Japan was Shambhala. They proposed to reinstate the ninth Jebtsundampa in Urga with a sanction from Lhasa so that he could act as a rallying point for a pan-Mongol movement that would include Buryatia. In 1937, Japan captured the rest of Inner Mongolia and northern China. Stalin accused the Buryat and Mongol High Lamas of spreading the Japanese propaganda about Shambhala and carried out even further-reaching purges and destruction of monasteries. In 1939, the Japanese invaded Outer Mongolia but suffered defeat by the combined Soviet and Mongolian armies. From that time onward, the Japanese turned their attention southward to Indochina and the Pacific. Stalin was now unchallenged in completing the repression of Buddhism in the Soviet Union and Outer Mongolia. When the Soviet forces liberated Manchukuo from the Japanese in 1945, Stalin extended his persecution of Buddhism there as well. Thus, long before communist Chinese rule, Stalin had destroyed most of the Buddhist monasteries of Manchuria and eastern Inner Mongolia. Buddhism never recovered in the area. So, those are all the various factors, geopolitical factors in Tibet and Shambhala being used to kind of propagate certain causes and movements. So, yeah. That's a historical and political background in Tibet and Shambhala, and before that, there was a very spiritual one, so we kind of discussed all aspects of Shambhala in Tibet and that entire area. So to close out the podcast, I am going to read an old Tibetan legend. Just more food for thought regarding Hollow Earth and Shambhala or Agartha. A young seeker sets off on a quest to find Shambhala, and after a long and difficult journey across the Himalayas, arrives at the cave of an old hermit. "Where are you going?" the hermit asked. "To find Shambhala," replied the youth. "Ah, well, you need not travel far," said the hermit, "for the kingdom of Shambhala is in your heart." So once again, certain belief systems explain Shambhala or any kind of paradise or utopia or any of these realms, majestic and spiritual realms, as residing within oneself, not without. And in certain spiritual systems, the earth is actually viewed as a metaphor for the heart. It's even an anagram, heart, earth. What is hollow earth? Is Shambhala within the earth, in the center of the earth, in your heart? It is in your heart, inside the earth. Many thoughts and concepts to ponder on Mindshock. If you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell for notifications. If you like the video, hit the like button. Feel free to share it across social media platforms. Any questions, comments, suggestions, leave them in the comments section. And like our Facebook page, you can also check us out on Twitter, Reddit, Patreon. This is Bruce McGuire signing off.